Um, Thank you for joining us today. This is the first Notre Dame Mexico virtual lecture. We're very excited about this series and very excited to have Professor Alejandro Estefan here as our first presenter. My name is Mike Talbot. I'm the director of our Global Center, Notre Dame International's Global Center, based in Mexico City. Thank you again for all joining. Before we start, I just wanted to run through a few housekeeping issues to help facilitate this conversation. First, please keep your microphones muted during the presentation. This will just help us to avoid background noise and keep things running smoothly. Secondly, when you entered the Zoom, your video should have been turned off. Feel free to turn it on or off, either is fine, but please be aware that we're recording this session. Of course, any final version of that will focus on the presentation, but I don't want people to have their images captured without their awareness. Next, we welcome your questions throughout the presentation. There is a chat feature at the bottom of the screen. It says chat. It has a little dialogue bubble, thought bubble icon. If you click on that and just text type your question, Professor Estefan will address it, hopefully address them all if we have time. And then finally, I just want to thank everybody in advance for your patience and understanding. This is a new technology and a new series, so we're learning as we go. And in anticipation of any technical difficulties or glitches, I just want to thank you for your understanding in that. So today we welcome Professor Alejandro Estefan. We're very pleased to have him here, virtually, of course. He is a Mexican native, grew up in Coyoacan, I believe, in Mexico City. Graduated from ETAM with an undergraduate degree in economics. Then completed a master's in public policy at the University of Chicago, followed by a PhD in economics at University College London. We were very lucky to have him, to draw him to Notre Dame about a year ago. So he's just finished his first year of teaching DOMers. He is an assistant professor of development economics at the Keough School of Global Affairs. And he just finished teaching a class on poverty policy. In fact, I believe grades were submitted yesterday. So he's jumping from one thing right to another, and we really appreciate that. If you would please join me in welcoming him and thanking him for joining us today. Please, Professor Estefan, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Michael. It's great to be here. First of all, I would like to thank you, Michael, for organizing these lecture series. I was delighted to learn that we have such a large audience. And so I would also like to thank you, everyone who is attending this lecture. Today I will be talking about poverty reduction policies in Mexico. And when I was preparing this talk, I didn't know exactly what was my audience. So instead of going for an academic type of lecture, I prefer to do sort of a policy type of conversation. First, I would like to establish with you some communication. So I created this student poll in slide.do. So if you could use your cell phone or your computer to log into slide.do, there is an event number 69176. And then if you go there, I will be asking you a question. So let me start by going there. The first thing I wanted to ask you guys is, what word comes to your mind when you think about poverty in Mexico? So if any of you can simply type in a word such that I'm able to see that we can establish some online communication, that would be fantastic. So the first word that comes up is despensas. So the idea that the government comes up with a basic basket of goods and then delivers it to poor people. We think about inefficiency, sort of about that policy, cash transfers, malnutrition, and so on. So if we have another one called cash transfers. Someone else wants to join. Okay, we have now we have a bunch of words. It's actually kind of difficult to read them all. Poorly regulated, inefficient. Dispensers is becoming sort of a trend word. But you can see the trend, right? So there is an element of cash transfers. There is an element of giving goods in kind. And there's also an element of insufficient policy that really doesn't work that well. But with that, now that I have sort of 13 answers, I'm going to move right into the presentation. So thank you for all of you who managed to take a look at the survey. Today I will talk about three things. First, I will talk about poverty trends in Mexico. What's the level of poverty in Mexico relative to other countries? And how has that poverty been evolving over time? Second, I will describe the policies that we have in place and how these have evolved over time as well. And then finally, I would talk about three different policy challenges moving forward: targeting of transfers and the poor. Second, governance and how to reduce corruption and inefficiency. And third, transfer conditionality. So what are the elements that we should be looking at when we think about these transfers? Let's start by looking at poverty trends. What you see in this graph is the poverty headcount ratio at $1.90 per day. Essentially, this is the fraction of the world's population that lives under $2 per day. And as you can see, poverty has been falling dramatically over the last 30 to 40 years. In fact, in 1980, we had 40% poverty rate. Today, we have only about 10%. Nevertheless, progress has not been homogeneous across regions. And so we'll start by using the US as a benchmark. This is the sort of solid blue line that you can see in the screen. Essentially, nobody in the US lives with under $2 per day. Now, when we compare that to other regions, though, you'll see that there's been a fast decrease in poverty in the East Asia and Pacific region. And so this comprises China, Australia, Philippines, South and North Korea, and so on. So there's been tremendous progress in that area, in that region of the world concerning poverty reduction. What you can see now in the black line is Latin America and the Caribbean. And as you can see, progress has not been as fast or as impressive. Nevertheless, some progress has taken place. And within Latin America, Mexico is not an exception. What we can see in this black solid line is the percentage of the population living under $2 per day in Mexico. And you can see it went from almost 20% in 1995 after the tequila crisis to less than 5% today. So there's been some reduction in extreme poverty in Mexico over the last 20 years. But when we think about the national poverty line, this is defined as the share of people who are able to purchase a basic food basket with their monthly income. We see that this national poverty line disguises some progress. There's been some decrease in the number of people who are actually in extreme poverty, or those people who live under less than $2 per year. But this progress has not translated into a reduction in the percentage of people that are not able to purchase a basic food basket. That said, it's also true that there's not been much progress in the number of people who are able to pay their rent. So what you see in this orange line is the percentage of the population in Mexico who are not able to use their full income to purchase basic food basket, clothing, education, healthcare, transport, and rent. And as you can see, around 50% in Mexico, 50% of the population in Mexico are not able to essentially pay the rent. And so there needs to be some progress in that front, and that hasn't happened yet. So the key policy question for us is, why has poverty not decreased more in Mexico in the last 30 years? Now, this is an important policy question because Mexico is not the only country that's in the same situation. Most of countries in Latin America face the same problem, and other regions such as Sub-Saharan Africa or South Asia. So taking a look at these issues of poverty in Mexico will also shed light to what's happening in other regions around the world. So let's now talk about policy. Economic theory tells us that there are two levers for poverty alleviation. The first of them is economic growth, this idea that a rising tide will lift all boats. And the second idea is that of intentional redistribution. With redistribution, I mean three things. I mean taxes, I mean transfers to the poor, and then I mean social insurance. Let's start by thinking about the first lever, GDP growth. What has happened in that front? What you see in this graph is real GDP per capita relative to its level in 1990. And so for the three lines that you can see here, they are starting at 1, meaning that we're comparing the situation of each country to what happened in the same country in 1990. And you'll see that GDP has increased in the US, almost 50%. But in Mexico, the GDP growth has been less than impressive. And now when you compare that to what happened in East Asia and the Pacific, you'll see that GDP growth is way more aggressive there. And it's certainly consistent with the poverty reduction line that we saw earlier today. Now, if you were to average the annual rate of GDP growth per capita in Mexico, it's only about 1% over the last 20 to 30 years. So we know that economic growth is way low relative to what's needed. In fact, most economics empirical literature overwhelmingly finds that poverty reduction is highly correlated to GDP growth. And in particular, there is this paper by Bethley that estimates that the annual growth rate needed to halve poverty in Latin America in 25 years is actually 3.8%. Now, this is obviously a very quite tall order given the current rate of growth. So the first problem is that there's not been sufficient economic growth. Now let's talk about policy. We talked about two levers. One of them is GDP growth. The second lever is that of poverty alleviation programs or redistribution. Here I will be not talking about taxes. I will simply limit the conversation to transfers and social insurance. And here I'd like to distinguish three different moments in Mexican poverty policy. The first moment is implementation of price subsidies and geographically targeted transfers that happened between 1990 and 1996. The second moment would be the use of conditional cash transfers and universal healthcare insurance. And finally, we have a third moment, relatively recently implemented, which is that of universal on-the-job training programs, also known as apprenticeship programs for the youth. So let's start by describing the first moment in policy. Here we're thinking about price subsidies and geographically targeted transfers. Government policy mainly consisted of three different programs. The first of them was government-run retail stores with subsidized staple prices. Let me give you an image. This should come to my mind. The idea is we have a retail store and everything in this retail store is subsidized. Anyone can go into this store and they can purchase whatever staple basic goods they have or they need. The second element of this policy was basic infrastructure programs in marginalized rural communities. And this included drinkable water, electricity, sewage, and housing conditions. And so just to give you an idea here, this is typically the way a hut would look like in rural Mexico. You can see that there's a dirt floor, children are playing there. Obviously the floor is dirty. It's likely that they will become ill if they continue to play in this situation. And furthermore, the woman in the household, she's working in the same place as the children are playing. What these type of programs do is they essentially give cement floors or hard walls to these rural huts. Okay, so that's the second element that we have. And then finally, we have subsidies for rural farmers to cultivate their crop of choice. Okay, that's sort of self-explanatory. I'm not going to talk about subsidies to rural farmers. So here I would like to ask you, what do you think the main flaw of these programs is, and why should they be changed? Why were they changed in the first place? So if you go now to the student poll, I'm going to project a different second question. And if you could answer that, that would be fantastic. We have 4 different flaws in the screen, or 4 potential problems with this set of policies. The first one is discounts do not address the most pressing needs of poor families. It could be the case that these poor families actually need education and healthcare instead of purchasable goods. Second, it could be that households do not necessarily invest in education in response to these subsidies. Third, we have the idea or the notion that subsidies will exacerbate pre-existing inequality in consumption within the household. Here, think about the head of the household having access to income, and he will decide whatever goods are purchased in these retail stores. And finally, we have retail stores subsidies end up benefiting rich families because they can always go into the store and pretend to be poor. So right now we have 10 answers, and I think it has 15 answers. And the sort of the most popular choice here was that price discounts may not necessarily address the most pressing needs of families. Families might be in need of education and healthcare. So how do we think about those things? Well, to think about them, we came up with a second set of policies: conditional cash transfers and healthcare insurance. Okay, so these logotypes should sort of come to your mind. You should be familiar to them. The first program was Progresa. This is a conditional cash transfer. It was created in 1997, and it marked a drastic shift in poverty policy, not only in Mexico, but around the world. Around 60 other countries started following Mexican experience after the creation of Progresa. Okay, and it solved many problems at the same time. First, Progresa provided cash transfers and nutritional supplements to individuals in low-income families as measured by a proxy means test. What do I mean by a proxy means test? Well, in developing countries, governments do not observe the income of households, right? There's nothing like the IRS knowing exactly how much you earn, okay? Nevertheless, household assets are observable to government officials. So say if you have a dirt floor, that's observable. If you have a toilet or if you have a television, all of those are observable. So what you can do as a government is you can create a household survey called the proxy means test to use assets, household assets, to predict actual income. Well, what Progresa did is exactly that. They created a survey, and the survey would select a household to be a recipient for the program if their predicted income, as measured by the proxy means test, was below an eligibility threshold. So the program really it solved the problem of identification or identifying the poor. Next, transfers were typically given to the mother in the household. So instead of giving the money to the head of the household, it would empower women by giving them the transfers, the monetary transfers. Furthermore, the program would tie the benefits of the program to children attending regularly to school and family members attending regularly to health clinics or checkups. It was a fantastic program in and of itself. It was also implemented from the beginning using a rigorous evaluation techniques like RCTs, or randomized control trials. To give you a sense, the program grew from benefiting 200,000 families in 1997 to benefiting over 5 million families and 30 million people in 2010, with an average annual benefit in US dollars of $715. And it was extensively evaluated by academics. There are very interesting findings. Overwhelmingly, we find that education improved. There is a higher enrollment of children in primary and secondary education. There was a reduction in dropout rates. There was a reduction in child labor health. There was an increase in the stature of children, a decline in infant mortality. Concerning household expenditure, we find there is an increase in the amount of money devoted to purchasing food. There is a reduction in out-of-pocket health expenditure. And finally, perhaps most importantly, there was an improvement in gender equality. Women became less likely to be victims of physical abuse, and women tend to spend more on children, so they tend to invest more in children than men, so that's also positive. The second policy was Seguro Popular, and this Seguro Popular was simply a national health insurance program with two main benefits. The first benefit was a package of basic healthcare services, and the second benefit was protection against catastrophic disease like cancer. Importantly, the federal and state governments were co-responsible for handling the program, and crucially, state governments were responsible for its implementation. It's somewhat similar to what's happening in the US, right? So if you think about the US right now, most states are in charge of handling the situation concerning healthcare, even though they might receive some amount of funding from the federal government. Now let's go back. Well, just to show you the positive effect of this healthcare insurance program, what you see here in the solid blue bright line is the share of people without health insurance in Mexico. You'll see that it went from 60% to only 20% after the program was implemented. Now, also important in this graph is to notice that the red line, which shows the amount of people without a formal job, is actually quite high. So there was no improvement in this front. So even though we have now healthcare insurance for the poor, it is also true that 60% of the individuals in Mexico do not have access to a formal job. Now let's go back to the polls. I will ask you a third question. And here I would like to know your view on this second set of programs. What is the main flaw of this second set of programs? The first option is job availability is more important than health and education. The second flaw is proxy means test exclude some of potential beneficiaries because this is sort of a flawed procedure. Third, transfers do not reach beneficiaries because of bureaucratic capture. And then conditional transfers will actually generate intergenerational dependence on welfare. So let's see what your opinions are. We have 11 answers. We have 15 now. It seems pretty even. But perhaps the most popular answer is that there is bureaucratic capture. That some officials in the government are essentially stealing the money from the transfers. Okay. So that leads us to our third moment in policy. AMLO. So the new president of Mexico, he tends to be very controversial. He's not an isolated case around the world. We have many controversial presidents now. And his policies have been, first of all, to dismantle the existing anti-poverty programs, including Progresa and Seguro Popular, and in their place, implement two different programs. The first of them is this apprenticeship program for unemployed individuals aged 18 to 29. And the second program is a centralized institution to handle healthcare across the country. That means moving from a model like the one we have in the US to a model like they have in the UK. So think about the NHS in the UK. We have an institution, a centralized institution handling primary and secondary healthcare. Okay. And to give a critical assessment of these programs, it's important to mention that apprenticeship and vocational training programs have succeeded in the past. It's clear to us now that vocational training raises the earnings and employment prospects of beneficiaries. However, it's also important to mention that vocational programs tend to be more successful than firm-provided training. So the idea here is you will have a more successful training program if that equips the beneficiaries to actually take their skills not only to the firm that they are working in, but also to other firms. Overall, however, we know that these are very successful in the developing countries, and it's likely that this program will succeed at least to some extent. On the other hand, there is no evidence whatsoever that healthcare centralization could have a positive or remedial effect on the existing healthcare system. Okay, that's not to say that the program will not succeed. It is simply to say that there is no evidence for that view. Okay, so now that I have described sort of what's poverty in Mexico, how does it look like? Second, what is the set of policies that we have in place? I'd like to leave you with a set of challenges moving forward. I have 3 challenges. The first of them is, what is the optimal trade-off between targeted and universal transfers? Second, what is the scope, the optimal scope of these programs? And third, how to improve governance to reduce or prevent corruption. Concerning targeting, let me give you some pointers. Universal policies, even though they eliminate horizontal inequities because they are given to everyone, they are also inefficient because they are not necessarily given to those who are in need. In fact, some of the people who are not in need receive those policies. Second, universal policies tend to lead to smaller benefits because the budget of the government is not limited, it's not unlimited, right? So if you're going to give a transfer to everyone, then that transfer needs to be small. And then third, in developing countries with informality, universal policies can be seen as a transfer from the informal sector to the formal sector. The idea is these transfers are financed through general taxes, and only individuals who are working in the formal sector are paying taxes. Well, guess what? All of these transfers are given to individuals who did not contribute anything to finance. Okay. If you want to think about this in terms of theory, I drew this diagram for you. What we have on the x-axis is the inclusion rate of these policies. When we are at 0, that means that nobody receives this social policy transfers. As we move further to the right, we are including individuals with higher and higher incomes until we reach 1. When we reach 1, everyone is actually benefited by the policy. And what we have on the y-axis is societal welfare, or the well-being of society from a theoretical perspective. The idea is when we give transfers to the very poor, welfare goes up. Because we want to help the very poor, we give them transfers. Nevertheless, as we start to include more and more people into these policies, welfare falls. The idea here is transfers to the poor become smaller because we're giving more and more transfers to everyone. And second, non-poor individuals start receiving transfers, and we wouldn't want to give them benefits. On the other hand, it is also true that something opposite is observed when we think about horizontal equity. When benefits are not given to anybody, everyone is the same in the sense that nobody receives anything. As we start giving these benefits to people, horizontal equity falls because we are leaving out people with very similar incomes. As we start to increase inclusion rate, horizontal equity increases at the end because now we are benefiting everyone. So there's a trade-off between horizontal equity and efficiency, or how well we target the poor. Okay, so that's what I have to say about targeting. Now let's think about the scale and scope of these programs. There's overwhelming evidence in economics that social policies induce long-run dependence of beneficiaries. There is this fantastic example by Mogstad and co-authors in which they show that in Norway, a very advanced economy, welfare receipt in one generation actually causes welfare participation in the next generation. So it's not only that an individual is sort of tied to these programs, it's also that if he's included in these programs for a long period of time, then his offspring will also participate in welfare. And to show you what I mean, I have this graph. I took this from their paper. What we have on the x-axis is the number of years after the approval decision to participate in welfare programs. And what we have on the y-axis is a probability that the offspring of the selected individual participates in welfare himself or herself afterwards. And as you can see, as an individual is more likely to participate for longer periods of time in a welfare program, also her offspring will be likely to participate in that. Now, that said, I would like to mention also that transfers, when they are designed to foster human capital accumulation, say, for example, education and healthcare, they will yield their return in the long run, okay? So we would like, ideally, to maintain these programs running for a long period of time, okay? So we need to find a balance between not fostering dependence on these welfare programs, but also keeping these programs running for long periods of time if they are designed to improve human capital. That's what I have to say about the scope of the programs. I'm going to sort of skip this graph from one of my papers. And what I'll do now is I'll talk about corruption. Okay, how do we prevent corruption? It is a well-documented phenomenon that benefits do not reach beneficiaries because groups of interest capture them in developing nations. So the current Nobel Prize of Economics, Abhijit Banerjee, he gives us an example of a situation when this is solved. And this is not in Mexico, this takes place in India, but it's nevertheless relevant and important for us. What he finds is that removing layers of intermediaries through electronic payment systems can actually lead to reductions in public expenditure, meaning reductions in corruption. I like this diagram that they have in their paper. What the diagram shows is two different potential schemes of things. On the left panel, what we have is the lowest possible level of government, called a panchayat, trying to get resources from a state pool, from a sort of a central government state pool, okay? But to get those resources, the panchayat has actually to go through the block and the district before the state pool can send the resources through a fund transfer back to the panchayat. On the right-hand side, what we have is a different scheme of things in which the panchayat communicates directly through electronic means with the state pool or the central government of India, and then the central government of India directly deposits the funds to the panchayat. Turns out that the scheme in the right is way more effective in reducing expenditure of the government than the scheme on the left. Now, another issue to tackle here is the potential for capture by political groups. Even if we manage to solve the sort of the electronic transfer issue, there is another sort of different and separate problem, which is that political groups will try to capture these programs and promote them as their own. Even though these are financed through general taxes, they'll try to say, oh no, but this is my program, and you will only be able to receive the benefits of the program if you vote for my party, okay? The idea is we need to find a way of changing regulation such that benefits should not be conditional on electoral preference, okay? Or dependent on the identity of the ruling local party. So what are the takeaways from this talk? First, extreme poverty has fallen in Mexico over the last 25 years. We are not living in a situation like the one we observe in sub-Saharan Africa. Nevertheless, only moderate progress has been made in reducing other more wider, broader types of policy. Second, economic growth is definitely needed to reduce poverty. It is a lie to say that we can reduce poverty without economic growth. So that should be clear to you now. Third, there are many challenges for the existing poverty alleviation programs. These programs will definitely not end poverty in Mexico, but they will contribute, okay? What are these challenges? I said, first, we need to identify the poor and target the transfers that they receive. Second, we would want to make these transfers conditional on human capital accumulation such that beneficiaries get education and then eventually they exit the cycle of poverty. And in the same sense, there's a third challenge, which is to avoid long-term transfers to prevent welfare dependence. And then we have two final challenges. One of them is to implement electronic systems to combat corruption. And finally, to design legal mechanisms to prevent political capture. Okay. I guess that's all I have to say concerning the presentation. So I just wanted to say thank you for taking the time to attend my talk.
Thank you very much, Alejandro. That was an excellent description of the situation in Mexico and some of the strategies being used to address it. If maybe we could run into the questions that we've gotten several from the group. So just to start thinking about economic growth in Mexico and specifically GDP growth, to what extent is that dependent or proportional to growth in the United States? Is that a linchpin for economic growth, and should that be an emphasis beyond some of these other programs?
Thank you. I mean, that's a fantastic question. I think that's one of the key puzzles that we face not only as an economy, but also as a world, how to increase economic growth without trade. Certainly, economic growth in Mexico is tied to trade with the United States. If trade with the United States stops, then economic growth in Mexico stops. But that's also generally the case with other economies. Think about China, right? The rise of China as a growing economy has been fostered by trade with the US and other advanced economies. What I would say here is that it's very important to increase and improve education levels. right? So a more educated society is way more likely to have economic growth, and also to try to remedy the existing market failures. And by market failures here, I mean that markets need to function in a competitive way. We need to avoid monopolies, and certainly many other anti-competitive practices that take place in the Mexican economy and are definitely a hindrance for economic growth. So the key lies in reaching an education level that allows Mexican citizens to not only receive targeted transfers, but also try to start with their own businesses. And second, to try to avoid anti-competitive practices in Mexican markets, to give a space for competition and allow everyone to participate. And that eventually will lead to economic growth. But it's impossible to think about economic growth without those two elements, education and market competition.
Thank you. Another question came from Marcelo during your conversation about conditional cash transfers and incentives. To what extent, and I know you talked on this a little bit about generational incentives, but to what extent does that encourage people to stay poor? And is there a moral hazard that the government needs to be worried about when implementing those kind of policies?
I think that's definitely true. I think if you assess eligibility for these benefits through a proxy means test, then people have the incentive to appear poor, right? So they have the incentive to not purchase a television or to hide the television when the government official is in the hut, right? So a government official visits the house, and then people will hide their TVs. What they will do is they make it appear as if they don't have a cement floor and so on. So definitely there is an incentive to remain poor. The important thing to keep in mind is that we need to make these programs, the receipt of these programs, tied to human capital accumulation. We need to tie the receipt of welfare benefits to attending to school, to getting an additional degree, to completing high school, to going to college and so on. Otherwise, there's no way we can sustainably remove these individuals from poverty. So definitely there is an incentive to appear poor or to remain poor if we test income using a proxy means test. Now, the other thing to say here is, I think there's a scope for improvement in the way that the informal sector is given these benefits. So for example, Progresa does not require you to have a tax payer number for you to receive the benefits. So say if I were to give you benefits, but I will only give them to you if you have a taxpayer number, then I will essentially ensure that I can observe your income afterwards, right? So there's a scope for improving the way in which the government measures the income of low or poor individuals.
Thank you. So Rodrigo has a question that's kind of similar to that on the flip side. So now, assuming that cash transfers are not conditional, that we have universal or some kind of basic income that's universally available, is there evidence on what recipients are likely to spend that on? I think the presumption here is that they wouldn't spend it on education and healthcare. Do we have a sense of what they are more likely to spend it on?
Yeah, so I mean, this is also a fantastic question. Certainly, there is a degree of paternalism that we would want to have. We wouldn't want to give cash transfers and then have beneficiaries spending them on alcohol and tobacco and the like. At the same time, we need to give the beneficiaries some degree of freedom so that they can use the transfers for what they need the most. Right? So you need to find this balance between giving beneficiaries enough freedom so as to choose what they need and preventing them from purchasing sort of a forbidden type of goods. Now, concerning universal transfers, though, the idea here is not only that of increasing human capital, but it's also about redistribution in and of itself. So if we give these transfers to everyone, we should not expect to have control over how they are spent. The idea is simply to reduce inequality in a way. So that's a twofold answer. First, we would want to control what households spend on, but to the extent to which we make them universal, we sort of need to drop this consideration of giving households freedom.
All right, another question here from Maggie, Maggie Guzman, asking, have there been any studies on the effects of vocational training in indigenous communities specifically? From a qualitative standpoint, this may separate youth from their families and from their culture.
That's a good question, Maggie. I'm not aware of any study that looks at that particular question of giving vocational training to individuals might in turn lead them to separate from their familiar culture. I know of no study that looks at that question. That's certainly an important question, though, to preserve identity of indigenous individuals. At the same time, I'd say, how do we think about these things? Indigenous individuals, if we do not do anything to help their economic circumstance, they will perhaps never leave the cycle of poverty, right? So we need to find a way of supporting and helping them without being intrusive to their culture. So that's a fantastic question. I think that remains unsolved.
You've talked a lot about government policies, rightfully so, but there's a question here asking about the involvement and the role of NGOs, social enterprises, nonprofits, the civil society, as well as, I think, for-profit enterprises here. Is there a role for them to play within a system of universal or conditional cash transfers? And what might that look like?
Yeah, so that's another fantastic question. What I would say here is that NGOs would be most useful in trying to shape the way markets look like, and in trying to address the market failures that we observe in Mexico. In trying to keeping accountable the government and the civil society insofar as competition, the degree to which we have monopolies or ill-designed regulation, that could be very helpful for Mexican society. If we do not have a voice that acts as a counterweight to government officials, then they are prone to do what they think is best, and that might not always be what's best for markets or economic growth.
Thank you. So there's been several questions about the informal economy and the informal sector. To what extent are there efforts to transition people from the informal sector, and how influential do you feel that would be if it were successful, maybe making conditional transfers or universal income contingent on participating in the formal sector, et cetera?
Yeah, so that's that question pertains first the banking system, and second the entering into the formal sector first. So let me start by talking about the banking system. Some informal individuals can actually put money in their bank accounts without the need of paying taxes. So that's sort of revealing that you can sort of take cash and put it in your bank account and then not being accountable for that cash. So you don't have to pay taxes on those resources. And so one easy way of improving things would be to require all individuals who have a bank account to also have a tax number, and also to pay taxes on every single dollar that they will deposit in the bank, right? Now, that obviously would require a strengthening of what the IRS in Mexico is, So we would have to have a stronger IRS that can monitor not only high-income individuals and formal firms, but also low-income individuals and individuals working in informality. And then the second part of the answer is to think about how to help young individuals access formal jobs. And I think that's exactly what this current program is aiming to do. Many times, young individuals never have the opportunity to access a formal job. And so if they never access a formal job, they will live the rest of their lives in informality. And so we want to transition them from school to formality. And one way of doing that is to subsidize formality, right? Once we subsidize formality, we've seen in other countries that individuals who receive these apprenticeship programs actually end up participating in the formal labor markets 20 years down the road. So what I would say is, first we need to improve financial regulation such that banks become better at detecting who is receiving income, even if it doesn't come from formal sources. Second, we need to introduce individuals, young individuals, to formal markets through apprenticeship and programs addressed to the youth.
Thank you. We have another question here from Henna. She asks, is there any evidence to support cash transfers being more influential in poverty reduction as opposed to interventions that might be more influential generationally? For example, housing.
Yeah. What I would say is that the evidence is very strong in that human capital accumulation is one of the channels to exit poverty, right? We know that individuals who get an education are less likely to be poor, not only in Mexico, but around the world, right? If you have a college degree, if you have a master's degree, if you have a PhD, then you're way less likely to be poor. And so in a way, all of the interventions that we have should not be targeting specifically conditionality or housing. What we would like to target is human capital. We need to move individuals from a state in which they don't finish, say, primary school, to a stage in which they finish the bachelor's degree or a master's degree, right? So that's ideally what will move a country from poverty to a high level of income.
And another question here from Shadwa. Are there any poverty reduction programs that have a limited duration so that it might limit this kind of generational dependence that you discussed? If yes, what do you think of them? Have they been successful elsewhere?
Yeah, so that's another fantastic question, Shadwa. Think about unemployment benefits. And probably not in Mexico, but in many other countries, unemployment benefits have a limited duration. You can only access them, say, for 6 months to 1 year. That will prevent individuals from sort of staying unemployed, right? And there's very sort of a robust empirical literature indicating that by limiting the time span in which we give unemployment benefits, the incentive is such that individuals exit this condition. Now, we have to balance that, obviously, with the consideration that you don't want to give unemployment benefits for too little of a period of time, because then it will be hard for someone to find a job so quickly.
So I think we have time for one last question, and it's kind of a big one. So I suspect we might need to go over. But Rodrigo asked, what if economic growth is not necessary? What if that's not as essential as we think it is, although may be helpful? What if the real issue is about equity and equitable distribution of the current economy?
That's another fantastic question. Thank you, Rodrigo. But again, I would first argue that empirical evidence shows us otherwise. If you think about the presentation that I just gave, think about the red line being East Asia and the Pacific. This is where poverty reduction was most pronounced over the last 20 to 30 years. And now think about their economic growth relative to their initial levels. The two curves look like somewhat opposite to each other. So in a way, economic growth is important. It helps us reduce poverty, right? I think that the question is more like, suppose we cannot access economic growth. So for some reason, we are limited in our economic growth. We cannot grow. Is there a way of redistributing current income such that we manage to reduce poverty? And the answer to that question is, yes, we can do that to some extent, but only to some extent. As I talked about, all of these transfer programs are designed to meet that goal. Nevertheless, they have not been as successful. And that's not only the experience in Mexico, but in other places as well. So what I would say, furthermore, not only concerning the success of these particular programs, is that if you engage in a very aggressive redistributive effort, what that will do is that will hinder investment. Because the people who are paying for those those redistribution are actually not gonna sort of stand there and just take it, right? They will invest less on the economy. And in turn, reductions in investment will reduce economic growth, and that will perpetuate poverty. So yes, of course, there is a scope for the redistribution as a means of addressing poverty, but it has to be limited. We cannot simply rely on redistribution to address poverty. So the two levers need to be in place. We need to have economic growth, and we need to have adequate redistributive policies. So I would say simply economic theory and empirical evidence is overwhelming in that economic growth is needed. The most recent episodes of progress have been taking place in countries with economic growth.
But it seems that the chat here is going quite crazy with a lot more questions. So if you don't mind sticking around for a little bit longer, we could maybe address a few of those as well. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine. That's
wonderful.
Fine.
Okay, so Tomas asks us simply, how did the Nordic countries achieve poverty reduction? What's the magic that they got right?
That's a very good, very, very fantastic question. So I would say the answer to that question would be, once again, twofold. No? They are starting from a different point relative to Mexico, right? So it's sort of an unfair comparison to say, oh, there's Sweden and there's Mexico. Well, Mexico didn't start from the same place as Sweden. Second, what they do is they engage in redistribution and what I would say social insurance, right? Not so much in giving transfers. The idea is their system would prevent you to fall in poverty due to a health shock or due to an unemployment episode or due to a disability episode. So say they are very good in, say, if someone acquires a disability, then providing income perpetually to that individual. Similarly, they are very good in giving unemployment benefits, in taxing high-income individuals. So they are very good in the tax part, and they are very good in the social insurance part. They do not rely so much on transfers. Now, when you think about Mexico, obviously this cannot be compared to Sweden because, say, the rural part of Mexico, first, there are no jobs there. There's nothing to insure anyone against. And so it's sort of an inadequate comparison. But what I would say is if we want to go there, what we have to do is instead of focusing on transfers, we need to focus on the way the tax system works and the social insurance that people have access to. Universal health care, unemployment insurance, disability insurance, and so on. So that's what would move us there. Obviously, we need economic progress and GDP growth in other areas like the rural parts of Mexico. They need economic growth. We need more infrastructure there. We need more firms and companies operating there and so on. So you need, if you want to go to that place, you need to have a sort of a social insurance system together with more economic growth.
Okay, another question from Maggie here. This one asks, what is the role of political institutions in poverty alleviation? In other words, what's the effect of democratic institutions versus more authoritarian governments?
Wow, that's another good question. Let me address it in a very sort of from a very historical perspective. Episodes of starvation tend to take place in contexts of monarchies or political sort of places where there is no democracy, say, like when the system fails or the political system fails, then we have starvation. That's what empirical evidence shows us. And the most famous example here is the Bengali starvation period after the Second World War in India. So what happened in India is that the government was not operating adequately, and as a consequence, sort of like a dictatorship or a non-democratic government, that led to starvation of the population. So what I would say is, in general, poverty is actually closely linked to political institutions. Democratic political institutions tend to work well, right? And they tend to prevent episodes of extreme inequality. So I guess the margin in which this is important or relevant is not so much the margin in which we're moving from extreme poverty to food poverty. It's more relevant in preventing extreme poverty from happening. So say like starvation and so on. I don't know if that addresses the question, but that's what I have to say. So that's what we know so far.
Well, thank you very much. This has been an excellent. Well, we've got one more that just came in from Lucy. Why don't we take that and then?
Yeah, let's take it.
We'll close up. Lucy asks, going off of Maggie's question, does political organization affect the level of economic growth or vice versa?
I would say that the evidence there is slightly more contradictory. So if you think about China, right? China has been growing at 10% rates yearly, and they do not have a democracy as such, right? So say it's important to mention that the degree to which political organization causes poverty, that's territory that we don't know so well. We do know that when there is no democracy, the starvation periods occur. That's what we do know. So periods in which a ruler would sort of completely disregard a group of the population, those are periods in which we observe starvation. But when thinking about the specific ways of political organization, we know way less about that. So there's no final word about that.
Okay, thank you very much. Again, we got one last, I'm gonna call this the definite last question. Rodrigo asks about KPIs, key performance indicators. Are there other performance indicators that are correlated to poverty reduction? I know you've mentioned human capital, education, educational attainment, et cetera. Are there other ones that are correlated that we can think about or are aware of? He gives the example, perhaps the improvement of well-being and things like that.
Well, concerning well-being, the discussion there is, what do we mean? What does well-being mean? There are many studies that show us that happiness is related to health, right? And so in countries where health in later stages of life is not guaranteed by the government, people tend to be sad, or they tend to be upset. Countries where access to healthcare is guaranteed, people tend to be happy. So it's not like you can separate happiness from objective living conditions. Importantly, as I said, current studies show us that happiness is related to the quality of the healthcare system. So I would say we cannot use happiness simply as an indicator for economic progress. We need to have objective conditions underlying that notion of happiness, right? Or of well-being, if you wish. So we need to have objective indicators that show us how well-being, quote unquote, translates into happiness, right? So I guess that's what I have to say.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for that. We're getting a lot of thanks to you over the chat for this excellent presentation. I think we all really enjoyed it and learned a great deal. So thank you very much for that. Wish you all the best back in South Bend, and congratulations on finishing your first year at Notre Dame.
Thank you so much, Michael. Thank you so much for your generous invitation, and thank you everyone for taking the time to be here.
I'll just real quick echo that thank you and encourage you all to join us next Tuesday as well. We'll have Vanya Smith-Oka, who's a medical anthropologist at Notre Dame. She'll be discussing her work studying the training of doctors here in Mexico. So I think that'll be really exciting. Look forward to seeing you all next week. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.